Hello everybody! Today I'm going to talk about my favorite rereads of 2018. This is kind of a top 5 list, but as usual I can't choose between some of my favorites, so I have ties and a couple of spots. Nobody's sad about that, I'm sure. So, I did a lot of rereading in 2018 and it really affected my reading experience. I just really enjoyed it, number one, but it's also just led me back to some things that I was really due to reread and re-experience. And so far, over the years when I have started rereading books, as I never used to do when I was younger, I've had a pretty uniformly good experience. I know a lot of people reread favorites from childhood and are really disappointed by them. I believe Joe Walton calls that the suck fairy. I have not had many run-ins with the suck fairy, with possibly the exception of Dragon Riders of Pern, but I still have a lot of nostalgia for those books. But anyway, 2018 was a really good year for rereading books, and I didn't run across any that I was disappointed by, so yay. But let's get into it. Perhaps my favorite reread of the entire year is Tehanu by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is the 4th book in the Earthsea cycle, and it marks a shift in the series when it becomes more adult and is dealing with very different themes. The first 3 books in the Earthsea cycle were basically young adult fantasy that didn't have many female characters. Then, many years later, Le Guin came back to Earthsea and she wrote Tehanu. And it is adult fantasy with a female protagonist, and it starts to answer the question of where are the women in Earthsea and what makes them powerful. Now, I reread the entire Earthsea cycle at the beginning of the year when Le Guin passed away in January, and I did a video on all the books and one of the short stories in Earthsea, so if you want to know more about like that and a deep dive into the series, I will link that video for you. Tehanu stands out in that reread and in the year in general because it's the one book that I changed my mind on when I reread it. I first read Tehanu when I was quite young, maybe 12 or 13, and I didn't get it. It was very different from the first 3 books. It was, of course, much more adult, and it was dealing with issues that adults have and that grown women have. And I didn't like it very much. I looked back on it for many years thinking that just wasn't a very good book. Why did Le Guin write that? And then I read it as an adult and I was blown away. This book is amazing and I loved it. In preparation for Revenant Gun coming out, which is the 3rd book in the Machineries of Empire series by Yoon-Ha Lee, I reread the first 2 books, which are Night Fox Gambit and Raven Stratagem, and oh my gosh, I love them even more the second time round. I'd really liked Night Fox Gambit when I read it for the first time. I'm sad I never did a review of it, like, Rachel, what were you thinking? But I really didn't appreciate some of the finer details of the plot and the world building until I reread it. And kind of the same thing with Raven Stratagem, which I originally loved so much for some of the characters like Mikades, but once again, I understood the plot and some of the broader things going on much more upon rereading them. They're so good. They're so good. And eventually I will reread the 3rd book, Revenant Gun, and I will probably feel the same way about that one. Sometime during the year, I decided that I really wanted to try listening to the audiobook versions of the Penric and Desdemona novellas by Lois McMaster Bujold. This is a series of fantasy novels set in her world of the 5 gods, though it is set in a very different time period and with entirely different characters from the novels also set in this universe. I'd read all of these originally in print when they were first published, but I decided that listening to the audiobooks would be a good idea, and it was. They were really well done. And I loved these novellas the first time I read them, and I think I appreciated them even more upon rereading them. So my 2 favorites from this reread were the first novella, Penric's Demon, where the characters are introduced, where you see Penric as a baby pretty much, and his first coming to terms with having a demon suddenly inside of him, and how his relationship with that demon, Desdemona, turns out. My other favorite, which is actually probably my favorite in the entire series, is, I think it's the 4th in chronological order, called Penric's Mission. This is the one that's longer. It's actually more of a novel rather than a novella. And this one is kind of the flip side to Penric's Demon in that Penric is no longer young and inexperienced. He is well educated, he has his sorceress abilities and he knows how to use them well. He has a very well established relationship with his demon, and he's also at his personal low where it seems like he isn't quite sure what he wants to do next, and it's so good. This series overall just takes me to a happy place every time because the main characters are essentially really good people who are kind and want to do the right thing for other people. Penric is a very generous and kind person, and as cranky as Desdemona is, she also does good things, I think partly because she likes Penric and they have a mutually respectful relationship. Anyway, loved my reread. No idea if there will ever be more novellas in this series, but definitely I will continue to reread these stories when I need something good and happy to read. Early on in the year, I attempted to reread a bunch of Discworld novels, and my favorite one from that endeavor was Going Postal. This is also my favorite, like all-time favorite Discworld novel ever. And it's the first in kind of a trilogy about Moist von Litvig, who is something of a scam artist, only he gets caught, and Lord Vetinari, who is kind of the tyrant of Ankh-Morpork, makes him rebuild different like public and government systems in Ankh-Morpork. In this one, of course, he is assigned to revitalize and rebuild the postal system. And I love everything about this, including that bit where they invent stamps, and it's so awesome. It's so awesome. I also really loved the sequel, which is called Making Money. Of course, that is Moist taking on the banking system, but Going Postal is just the epitome of Discworld for me. My last big reread of the year was Fruits Basket by Natsuki Takaya. I reread all 23 volumes of this and I loved it. This is my favorite manga series from when I was younger. I was a massive Fruits Basket fan in my early teens, to the point where I, a shy introvert, was actually involved in online communities and reading scanlations and all of that stuff. It was my life for like 4 or 5 years. And then I decided to reread it, this time as an adult and over about 2 months rather than 4 or 5 years. And it was still just as good, but it was a very different type of story for me. Obviously I was approaching it as an adult and I was noticing things that I just wasn't going to notice as a kid. There's a lot of abuse in this story, a lot of scars from physical, mental, psychological, emotional abuse. And I noticed so much more why the main character Toru is such an important influence in the characters' lives, because they are traumatized and scarred, and she is basically the kind mother figure who accepts them as they are and isn't hurling abuse at them, basically. So yeah, I mean, when I originally read this, it was much more of a romance. I was very into the Toru, Kyo, Yuki sort of love triangle thing, but yeah. I feel like this is just a good story. It has a lot of characters and a lot of complexity. It has its comedic moments, but also some very dark moments, and a good ending, a much better ending than I had originally remembered. So those are all of my favorite rereads of 2018. As you can probably tell, it was a wonderful year for revisiting old favorites, and I wasn't disappointed by any of them. So let me know if any of these are also your favorites, or if you reread any books in 2018 that were particularly memorable for you. Thank you so much for watching this and all my other end of the year videos, and I'll be back to talk to you again soon, and until then, bye.